So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I hope you enjoyed yesterday and had a good time at the reception last night. We're so happy to have you here. You know, we couldn't do this conference without our sponsors, and our silver sponsors this year are the Government of Canada, Pacific Gas and Electric, Sempra Energy, Wells Fargo, and I want to thank also the sponsor of our charging station, Bank of America. I think many of you took advantage of that. I saw lots of phones plugged into the charging station out, where the food is, out in the reception area. We're very happy to have that this year. So we have a very jam-packed day, and we wanted to start a little bit later this morning just to give everybody a chance to get some breakfast. But our first session this morning is Influential Women in Climate. And to get us started in that conversation, I want to have Danielle Azoulay. She's the head of CSR and Sustainability for LOreal USA. I think she's the perfect person to give us some context for this conversation. You know, L'Oreal actually has a contest every year for women who are really making a difference in their community. I think that is so cool. Danielle, do you want to come on up?
Good morning, everyone. Gosh, I'm impressed that so many people are here this early. I hope everyone has their coffee because we're about to talk about an important issue. In a moment, I'm going to bring up our amazing panelists to discuss how and why climate change disproportionately impacts women and why engaging women in a meaningful way on solutions is critical for us to make the progress that we need. First, I want to give you some context. As Janet mentioned, I lead the CSR and Sustainability program for L'Oreal USA, and as the largest market for the largest beauty company in the world, women are a critical stakeholder throughout our value chain. Women, of course, are our largest customer. 70% of our workforce is women, and women are found everywhere in our supply chain, even as farmers at the very base or beginning of the supply chain. And that's why when we launched our global sustainability strategy called Sharing Beauty with All in 2014, understanding all of the ways that we could empower women was a priority. I'm proud to work for a company that was recently recognized by NAFI as the top 10 companies for executive women in 2019. Is the founding member of the C40 Women for Climate Initiative, which is a mentorship program for female leaders working tirelessly on climate issues. We work with female cooperatives to guide the implementation of sustainable agriculture and fair labor programs in developing countries all over the world. And we also prioritize supporting women-owned businesses with our purchasing power as part of our solidarity sourcing program. In BSR's 2018 Climate Nexus report entitled Climate and Women, they go into depth on how climate change does not affect all people equally. Because women face larger systemic barriers than men, including socioeconomic, political, and legal barriers, women's options to protect themselves and their families are restricted in the face of climate catastrophes. Systemic gender inequality creates insurmountable barriers for women to adapt and react to climate change. Issues like unpaid work and wage inequality, discriminatory laws, restrictions on land ownership, and lack of participation and underrepresentation in decision-making, whether that be within the family unit or in setting climate policy. Engaging women actively on climate change solutions could lead us to practical and readily implementable solutions. As evidenced in Paul Hawkins' book Drawdown, educating girls and access to family planning resources are two of the top 10 climate change solutions that we can scale right now. Currently, women in North America control over half of the wealth, make 80% of all consumer purchases, and start 70% of new businesses in the US. Just think about how leveraging that potential towards climate solutions could accelerate renewable energy integration and bolster local economies for greater climate resilience. So with that, let's get into more depth on this topic with our amazing panelists. First, I'm going to bring up Vicki Arroyo. Vicki is the Executive Director of the Georgetown Climate Center at Georgetown Law. Come on up, Vicki. You get some entrance music. Next, we have Diane Regas, is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Trust for Public Land. Welcome, Diane. And next, we have Lisa, who's the Environmental Business and Engagement Executive at Bank of America. Come on up, Lisa. Hear me? Good morning? Yeah? Okay, good. Here I am. Thank you all for joining us today. I wanted to start by sort of really diving a little bit deeper on the opening remarks and asking, why is gender an issue in the climate change, sustainability, and environmental policy arena? These are, issues that you guys work on every day, and maybe we can get the different perspectives.
So thank you. I thought your introduction was great, and you touched on some of the disparities, especially internationally for women, in terms of income and political clout. And after conflicts and disasters, including in our own country, women often are disproportionately affected. So just to give one example, in my home state of Louisiana, which of course was affected by Katrina, the women-led households were disproportionately affected, especially when it came to trying to regroup and come back, because the women were often caretakers for both the elder generation as well as children. They had limited incomes because going into Katrina, they had more poverty in their households. They 26% versus men's 20% in New Orleans. So, there are those disproportionate burdens on women, and because we're often the caretakers of families, that falls more on women. On the other hand, there are a lot of wonderful women leaders here, and I know Diane's got a list that she's going to share too, and there's a lot of opportunity for women to lead in climate and environment, and so we look forward to discussing that today as well.
Great. So why, from your perspective, Diane, is gender a key issue in climate?
So there's a lot of approaches to talking about that, and you heard Rich yesterday from Bank of America talk about how making loans to women heads of household can have a really outsized impact. But I want to focus my answer today on diversity, because I do believe that we need to embrace the idea that diversity is strength. And so I've made a little list of some favorite women leaders, because I think you can see, as you think about those people, what they bring something different to the table. So here's my 8. Christiana Figueres. Yeah. Without her persistence, we wouldn't have a Paris Agreement. I believe that. Greta Thunberg, who isn't even 20 yet. She's like 16, right?
The kids who are on this climate issue right now are
the courage that she's bringing to this, the insight and kindness is really incredible. Antha Williams, a lot of us know at Bloomberg, leader, helped put that film together we saw last night. Kathleen Welch, who is a little bit of a behind-the-scenes actor, but brings such political insight as to how to inspire people in our country to move forward. Lisa Jackson, leading environmental sustainability at Apple, and of course was at EPA as well, bringing the scientific and engineering background that she has to the table, her roots in Louisiana, to make a huge difference at one of the world's biggest companies. Incredible. Gina McCarthy led EPA, got the carbon rules done at a moment when hitting the accelerator was possible. She hit the accelerator hard. And then when she stepped out of office, she's, I know, inspired a lot of us for finding ways to move forward. She came to a retreat I was at and said, it's time to put our big boy pants on, or big girl pants on.
Or gender-neutral pants on.
Or just pants.
Yeah,
she said that recently at our event.
She said gender-neutral pants. It's really funny. Hillary Tompkins, who's a Navajo woman who was Solicitor General at Department of Interior. Kate Brown, who's the governor of Oregon, and just determined to move her state forward. And so that diversity of women leaders adds to the climate leadership that we need, and we need all of us to do everything in our power. And so they're an exemplar of that. So that's what I wanted to focus on this morning.
Yeah, it's like all cultures, all generation, everyone,
exactly.
All hands on deck, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's great. How about you, Lisa?
So I think what's really amazing about what you guys have brought to this conversation is that we're trying to make better decisions. And so when we make better decisions together, you said all hands on deck, that's really how we look at it at Bank of America. And I know we're here to talk specifically about climate and about environmental sustainability in that realm, but we've really looked at the whole of environmental, social, and governance together, and it's everything. It's not just environmental considerations, but it's do we have representation from all of our communities in our leadership? Right, so when we look at our leadership, when we look at our employee base, do they look like the communities we serve? Mm-hmm. Do they understand the communities we serve? Do we have parental leave policies that make our employees better able to be a functioning employee? Are we able to bring our whole selves to work? I think that all of those policies work together. It's not just this piece over here, but it's really everything all combined. And then, we're particularly proud of Bank of America. We have our board of directors is a third women, which is huge. And I think that, when you think about making good decisions and bringing all the voices to the table, we look to the top and we see that we're doing that all the way through our organization.
That's great. I think that leads me right into my next question. So what meaningful steps can a company take to advance gender balance, inclusion, and diversity in the workplace? Really, it's this diversity of ideas, making sure that the decision makers are reflective of the community and also the workforce, and how do we ensure that is a sustainable mindset, within a corporation or in society, really?
So I guess, building on with what I just said, when I think about, can our employees come and help make good decisions today? And I mentioned parental leave. We give 16 weeks of parental leave for maternity and paternity. And so, we feel like that contributes to the health and the fabric of our communities, because our employees, they live and work in those communities. And so then they feel like they're more able to give their very best to the organization. But I think what it also does is it connects, and I know that yesterday we talked a little about we're better when we're connected, but it really connects our people with the employees, with the company, with our shareholders, with our stakeholders, and I think that that all is part of the same ESG philosophy that we have.
Yeah, great. Vicki, Diane, do you guys have a perspective on that? What are the things that we need to put in place to make sure that mindset is around for?
A lot of companies now really pride themselves on being data-driven. There's so much data, artificial intelligence, massive amounts of data that you can look at to drive profitability, to drive other impacts. Interestingly, the data are pretty clear that companies that have a third to half women on the board tend to be more profitable. And so I would think start with the board of directors. If the board of directors it has 0, 1, or 2 women, which a lot of companies do, that's probably not best for the company, and it's certainly not setting an example for employees. Women CEOs are still rare, especially in big companies and in big NGOs. I think it's just important to focus on the top. Of course, we all need to have programs, and we do, and you do, to help women grow their careers. But I think it's time for us to be talking seriously about the top.
I think there was an interesting article in the Times like 6 months ago. It said, the headline was, there are more CEOs with the name John than there are women CEOs. And I was like, oh, we have some work to do. That is alarming. But anyway, yeah.
And I want to acknowledge these issues are complex. There's been some really good work about kind of why it is. And it's not people sitting in a back room saying, oh, I don't want to put any women on this board. It's much more complex than that. And I think recognizing as leaders, as we all are, that as we evaluate and think about people's performance and listen to what's the story of their performance, what have they accomplished, it's on average, women and men are going to tell that story differently, and we need to learn to listen differently to different kinds of people and how they talk about what they've done and try to hear in a consistent way.
Just to pick up on that, I think we have seen some examples coming out recently with the American Economics Association, for example, where when women surveyed, 48% said they believe they experienced sex-based bias within the last 10 years in the field, whereas only 3% of men felt the same way, and 20% of women said that they had been discriminated against due to marital status and or caregiving roles, whereas only 4% of the men did. And so to Lisa's point about childcare, I want to give a shout out to Norway, a country led by women, and I know Karina's here from the embassy, because they've put into place a law that requires that, or doesn't require, but basically takes back the leave if the men choose not to take it, and they can't transfer it to the mothers. So fathers of children get 15 weeks of non-transferable parental leave rather than the already generous leave that was available. And now 90% of the fathers are taking that leave. And of course, it's changing the dynamic and the experience for them in terms of the relationships with the children, in terms of how they view the role of childcare. So it's making their lives richer and giving them more opportunities and helping the women as well in their careers. So I think those kind of policies can really make a difference.
And as a country and society are also leading on climate change, so interesting how those things, just to bring it all back to climate change. But yeah, okay. So what key strategies can be employed to ensure the voices of women are equally heard and valued, especially within this conversation, as women bear the brunt of the responsibility of raising families and keeping the home on top of careers? I once heard a Indigenous rights activist say, just the fact that you have the brain space to worry about climate change is a privilege. And so interestingly, I thought that was really fascinating because I had never sort of thought of it that way, that if we want all the people at the table, we have to sort of remove the barriers even for them to be able to think about how they can get involved. So what do you think are key strategies that we can work towards?
So I'll just pick up on that brain space part. I think women are particularly good at multitasking. I don't know about you guys, but I see a lot of people made it here for a very early breakfast, including men, so thank you, because we certainly need men to be champions for women as well and for families, so thank you all for being here. I think a big part of it is trying to deal with what might be unconscious bias, as Diane was saying, that all of us have, whether we're men or women, and of course we see this with the Black Lives Matter movement as well as Me Too, that things that people just sort of assumed were not issues, I think, under further review and consideration are issues throughout our society that we all just have to be aware of. And part of it is, especially for leadership positions, to make sure that the pools of candidates are diverse in every way, because it will make the outcomes better and the work better as well. But I think there's plenty of room in the climate space for women, and we need all those voices because this is a heavy lift, and we need diversity in all kinds of ways in terms of ethnic, racial, income, and youth. And so glad to see the youth movement really taking off here.
Great.
I want to talk about the top and the common conversation and the people who have a really hard time getting into the conversation both. I'm going to start with an example. I talked yesterday, and I hope many of you were here to hear about the importance of parks as a climate solution. I won't repeat all that. But there's a group of grandmothers, mostly grandmothers, in Los Angeles called Equipo Verde. And at the Trust for Public Land, we actually helped organize them, but they are their own voice. And when we started out working with them and talking about parks for their neighborhood, there were actually some parks close by that they thought that they weren't allowed into. And we worked with them in some alleyways in Los Angeles. Los Angeles has a lot of alleyways. And we worked with them to green some alleyways so that places that were filled with trash and quite dangerous now have fig trees growing along the edges and stormwater capture in the alleys. The women of Equipo Verde, all of whom I think are immigrants to this country, many of whom are much more comfortable in Spanish than in English, have started to find their voice over the course of a few years of working. We've been working with them, or for them, I think is probably appropriate. When I sit down with them, I feel like I work for them, which is good. But when they sort of realized that they could have a voice in Sacramento and go to Sacramento and argue for what they needed for their communities, that was a breakthrough. And then just 2 weeks ago, they showed up at the Los Angeles County Supervisor meeting. The county supervisors in LA are a powerful group it's a small group. And what they were demanding, what the Equipo Verde were arguing for, was that money that had been put aside for green infrastructure, some of it should be reserved to go to the most vulnerable communities, communities of color, impoverished communities, and some of it should be set aside for the people who needed it most. And after developing their voice over the course of years and realizing that they could be heard, and seeing that in action, they did it. They convinced the supervisors to vote unanimously to take that action. So I think engaging women in lots of different ways is important. Those women own their community in a different way because they're there, they have been there, they have seen the problems of their community. So I think that's one really important answer. The other is to pay attention. I would ask all men to refuse to serve on panel discussions like this if there's no women on it. There just are too many women who've got an appropriate voice and something to say for there to be the answer of we can't find somebody. And I think that really sends an important message of inclusion. And we all need to go further with that, and I recognize that and I embrace it. But I think that's a start. In my experience, many, many times over the course of my career, I've been the only woman in a room. And I know how isolating that can feel. It can feel that way for people of color. It can feel that way for people who are differently abled. So we need to pay attention and count and work with people. I just, as a leader, I also have performance conversations with people, both men and women, about whether they're listening. Are you listening in the room? Are you letting the introverts speak? Are you hearing what people have to say? So we have to pay attention. We have to count it. We have to manage it, because we all know if you measure it, you'll manage it. You can manage it, and we can make a difference.
Great.
So I want to pick up on a couple of things. I think, one thing that occurred to me is we have an employee satisfaction survey that's done every year. And there's always a question that asks, do you feel that you can give feedback without fear of reproach, right? Do you feel...
It's an important question.
Right, it's an important question to ask. And I think that it's all well and good to have people in certain places, or to have women in leadership, or to have all of the building blocks that we're talking about. But if the actual culture is such that people don't feel like they can actually say what they're thinking, then are you really bringing all of the voices to the table, right? You might have the faces there, but are they really bringing their thoughts and integrating those thoughts? So I think that's a really interesting thing. But I think also, again, with the all hands on deck conversation, I've heard, since we've been here today, urgency. I've heard that word come up a lot. And there is urgency. And I know for those of us who've been in this work for a long time, we've been saying that for a long time, but I really feel like now is really the time. And so we're trying to work on all fronts to address climate. So we have philanthropic work, which Rich Brown leads. He was on your panel yesterday. We work with water.org. We work with organizations all over the world to make sure that women have the ability, the luxury, the headspace to do other things and aren't just caring for the family, for example. We also are deploying capital. Rich mentioned we have a $125 billion environmental business initiative. And so we're lending money to and deploying capital to address these issues. And then we also have internal work that we're doing operationally. We're going to be carbon neutral by 2020. Mm-hmm. So we're doing all of these things, but we can't do it with any one piece, right? And, not to be melodramatic, but, it is all hands on deck. It is all tools in the tool belt. And we need to really make sure that all of the voices are in the room. And I think that, we talk about equity, and I know that was a big theme of yours yesterday as well. If we don't have the ability to bring all of the voices in, then we'll lose the ability to do any of this, and the urgency, will be lost.
At L'Oreal, I mentioned we have a 70% female workforce. So our gender balance is actually, or our challenge is different. You can imagine not many men want to necessarily work at a beauty company, although we have like a very robust engineering and science, and we own our own facilities. And so there are and also our marketers. I mean, there's just so many sort of opportunities within our organization that men can have a seat at the table as well. And so we're always, trying to figure out how do we get more men in our organization. So it's interesting that just the different industries and the unique challenges that everyone faces.
It's actually have that same issue, and certain fields within the nonprofit community have that same issue. There's very few men, for example, in philanthropy.
And something that I noticed in teaching is that when I teach a course that includes health with climate change, it's like 90% women who sign up for it. And I was struck by one of the Bloomberg publications out there yesterday, which is a beautifully done publication, and there were a lot of different initiatives and collaborations listed, but there was one that was focused on climate and health, and that picture was very diverse, except for gender, and it was mostly women. And so I do think that there's something there that, maybe the connection with women and families often brings them to a conversation around health. And of course, people like Gina McCarthy have been terrific about connecting those dots, as well as a lot of the kind of groups that Diane was talking about and who work with in their communities where they see local impacts of air pollution and water quality issues and toxics issues from Superfund sites and all of that. But that nexus between climate and health, I think historically has felt a little bit gendered. Whereas when I teach just a straight up climate change in the law practicum, it's 50-50, men and women.
Fascinating.
That is fascinating. Well, so I want to leave some time for questions. I have one last question. So as we wrap up this portion, what lessons from your own career would you like to share with women just getting started in this field? Do you want to start, Vicki?
Yeah, I'll start. I mean, I think it seems sort of trite, but I would say, have mentors and be mentors. And I feel like that's as true for the men in the room as well as for the women, both so that the men continue to mentor women, because certainly over my career, I've had more male bosses than female bosses, and they've been completely wonderful, and that's so important. And I don't want things like the Me Too movement to discourage people from having important work and career relationships with each other. I think often people identify mentors or mentees in ways that are, more personal, people who remind them of themselves. So sometimes that can be gendered, but I think, again, if we make a conscious decision to try to reach out as women to young men and as senior men to women to continue those kinds of relationships are really important. And frankly, just friendships. I mean, I'm friends with so many people here, including this lady, who's gotten me out of my comfort zone many times and has taken me on big hikes and stuff that I've got to prepare for. And
she's in training right now.
I'm in training for a hike that she's going to take me on. And she's also a wonderful baker and baked my wedding cake, I have to say. So she's this amazing, high-powered person. But, we have these relationships that extend beyond the roles that we interact in. I mean, there are so many state leaders here, current and former women who work in state governments, which our center works for, supports every single day. And I admire them so much. And what's lovely about this experience is that we stay in each other's lives as people move on to other work and to other jobs and to other roles. And those relationships are equally, if not more important, I would say, than even the mentor kind of relationships.
Uh-oh, because I was going to say something similar. But because I want to focus yes to everything you said, including that wedding cake, which was fun.
It was great.
But I do want to talk about the men in my life who have made a difference. And how many of you saw RBG, the documentary? Yeah, a good number, probably most of us. And one of the things I just watched it, I finally got caught up. And one of the things that came through was how Ruth Bader Ginsburg's husband played such an important role in her success. Most women I know at leadership levels, their partner is playing a really important role in their success. And oftentimes it's different than the men I know as leaders. Oftentimes women are in a relationship with someone else who has an equally challenging career, and having that equality at home is really, really important. And I certainly, my husband, when it was very unpopular, took paternity leave when our second child was born, our third child was born, and that made really important moments in my career possible. I had terrific mentors, including Bob Perciasepi, who's here somewhere, who I would walk on hot coals for. And I think that mentoring role, that demanding equality at home, recognize you can't do it all. You can do a lot, but you can't do it all, and you need people in your life that are going to support you at key moments. And I think I grew up in a time when the idea of racial blindness and gender blindness was kind of the ideal. If we could be colorblind and gender blind, then everybody could be equal. And I'm so glad we're mostly past that, and the idea of bringing diversity to the table, making that a strength, and really valuing the full set of identities that others bring to the table, to me is a really important part of how young women can succeed going forward.
So I have 2 bits of advice. Obviously, mentors are very important. One is whenever I talk a lot to people who want to work in sustainability or want to do environmental work, and often they're looking for that perfect job that has the word environmental in the title or sustainability in the title. And I always say, you can do this work from any job in any company almost. We work every day with people from procurement, from supply chain, from legal, from risk, from compliance. You can be an environmental professional or a sustainability professional from any part of the company. So don't just look for that one keyword. So that's one sort of bit of logistical advice. But then also I would say is give and receive honest feedback. That would be my advice. I have the pleasure of working for Alex Liffman. She's our global environmental executive, and she's an incredible manager, and she gives really honest feedback. And I think that it's all well and good to say, oh, you're doing a great job. Yeah. But if you really give honest feedback about, you could have done this better, you could have done that, and I think that it's hard for women particularly to give super honest feedback that's actually constructive and useful, and then also to receive it. So I think that is a super important thing to keep in mind.
Great. Excellent. Well, I think we probably have some questions. I can't really see you guys, but is there a roving mic somewhere? There we have one.
Hi, Ashley Allen from Mars. I wanted to ask you for your perspective on this amazing influx of women in Congress this time around. First of all, how you think that might change the dynamic for environmental action, for climate action on the Hill, and then specifically in your sectors, what are you looking for from Congress that you think this new influx of women might open up for your sector?
So, yeah, thanks for bringing that up. The House is really on the move now, and Representative Castor of Florida is now the head of the Select Committee, and I'll be meeting with her and getting to know her. She's also an Emory alum, so that was a connection that we made through that, as well as through the substance. And Anna Unruh-Cohen, who is a friend to many of us, of course, a scientist who's been, working on these issues for many years, is back at the Hill now working for her. And we see other women on committees, staff as leaders, like Kathy Dendrick. So both as members, but also, I would say even more so to the point that we were making earlier, sometimes it's hard for women to maybe get the leadership job, but often the second-tier jobs in all of our workplaces are the women who are often, the ones with a lot of the ideas and the relationships. And so we are taking full advantage of that, and they're certainly asking for advice in a way that hasn't been the case for many years now. I had the opportunity to testify recently before the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and they really are trying to find bipartisan opportunities to work together. And so we talked a lot about electric vehicles and streamlining some of the processes that make it challenging for people to, pay from one charging station to another, or to have consistent signage, to work on funding corridors, all kinds of things like that. And of course, there are much more ambitious proposals that are being debated that women are behind too. And Nancy Pelosi herself, of course, has long been a leader on climate, and quite quickly really got past the Waxman-Markey bill through the House. So it wasn't her fault that it failed in the past, but we are seeing this new resurgence of energy. And we have the privilege, like I said earlier, to work mostly at the state and local level, and women have been leaders for quite quite some time. Not necessarily as many in the governor's positions, although that's changing too, but often in the agencies, the departments of environment and energy, you see more women leaders. And even in transportation agencies, we're seeing more women leaders all the time, so it's always a pleasure to work with them. And one thing I would just say is a shout out, I know many of you are members of WEC. There's also a group called Women WTS for the Women in Transportation. I think it's great. I mean, I'm one of those people who started my career in the 70s and, thought, well, I think the way to be a feminist is really just to do good work and whatever it is you do, but I think as you get older and you really do appreciate the importance of these relationships, you see that joining those kinds of alliances are just like a nice way to live your life and just to add something that is sharing personal experiences and building relationships outside and yet beneficial. So not just from a networking perspective, but from a personal perspective, I think it's really important to sort of join those kind of affinity groups in your respective areas too.
I was fortunate to start my career in Washington working at EPA for quite a long time. And I feel even more fortunate now to be focusing my time outside of DC, because what happens in the Beltway is really determined by what happens outside the Beltway. It's a reflection of what's going on in our country. So the fact that so many women were elected is, I think, connected to the fact that so many of them were willing to talk about climate change. You can look at the data and it supports that. I think it's extraordinarily important for companies to talk about climate change, to talk about it when you meet with representatives, when you meet with your senators, when you meet with other elected officials. Climate change is real. It's caused by humans. We can do something about it. And having companies saying that consistently is even more important today than it has been, I think, at any time in the past decades. And being those women who were elected to the House were elected in part to address climate change, but we're not where we need to be yet. And we have to make it okay to talk about climate change in all circles. And that's something that I think all of us can lead on.
I will echo that, and I think it's been a foundational, the foundational element of our environmental programs for more than a decade. We were very early on in saying exactly that climate change is real and is our responsibility to address it. And I think hopefully if we keep having this conversation, it will become more comfortable. I hadn't really thought about it that way in terms of we have to be able to talk about it everywhere. But I think that the changing face of Congress is a really empowering and incredible time that we have. And I think that we need to really seize this moment where we've brought in additional voices, which goes back to what we were talking about earlier, right? Having everyone at the table, we're going to make better decisions, we're going to have better conversations. So I'm really enthusiastic about it.
Mm-hmm. Me too, yeah. Any more questions out there? No more questions? We answered all your questions. Well, we did a great job then, that means. Okay, well, I guess, Janet, we're going to be right on. Oh, we do have another question. Sorry, I can hardly see anybody. There you go.
So, hi, Vicki. Lisa McNeely with the City of Baltimore.
Hi.
So one of the things that I've seen in my time in sustainability as a woman is that some companies, as we've gotten more serious about it, have really had such a strong focus on the energy and the technical side that you have this kind of, I call it the energyification of sustainability, which really does then reward those with those STEM backgrounds, which to this day do tend to be predominantly male, predominantly white. I, however, see the value of those softer skills, more on the liberal arts side of things. My question would be is if you are seeing women who are going to school and are entering the field, would you encourage them to still try to develop those strong skills and find the right places to sort of keep that a part of the work that we're doing? Or should they be looking to sort of also have those sort of STEM type skills?
I'm happy to also talk about this, but I think So my master's is in environmental education, so I am able to do this job. Most of my job is actually educating people about the importance on taking action on several environmental topics, not just energy, but energy being a key one in order to mitigate climate change. And so it's also, it's the easiest to measure. It's also the most advanced piece at this point when we talk about energy, water, and waste, which is why I think there's been so much movement on energy, especially from a corporate perspective. But I would say both are really important. My very first job in sustainability was working for a large global apparel company working on responsible chemicals management, and I am not a chemist. But I was able to understand that developing and implementing a strategy on responsible chemicals management and having the technical expertise are not necessarily the same thing, and that's okay. There are tons of technical people out there. It's about knowing your company, knowing the infrastructure of what is the connective tissue, what is the way your company functions, and how do you really layer in these important topics into day-to-day business, not necessarily how many parts per million of a certain chemical is acceptable. That is absolutely a critical piece of the puzzle, but it's not the whole puzzle. And so I think no matter what your skill set is, no matter what your interest is, like we were saying, a diversity of ideas is important, and backgrounds are important. So even if you want to, study education or study business or study law, there are, you don't have to have that hardcore STEM background in order to make a difference in the corporate piece of sustainability.
Danielle, can I just add,
Sure.
I love the point that we need to make diversity a strength. Mm-hmm. And it's not always, right? Because diversity can create conflict, and so it takes work. And I would agree that diversity across disciplines needs to be a strength. Just ask Amazon. They really could have hired an anthropologist in New York City, and they would have been in a very different spot if they listened to her.
Yep.
And so my own background is both law and environmental science, and having that mix has been quite helpful to me. So I think individually we need to open up our ears and open up our minds to the different disciplines. And I don't know whether, when I meet a school kid like I talked about yesterday, and she's talking about studying climate science, I get really excited and encouraging. I don't know what it'll look like in 10 or 20 years, what the division among different disciplines will be between men and women. But I do know that we will always need to be listening to the different disciplines, and that sometimes that takes some pushing.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you brought up education. We have a program we call My Environment, and it's our employee education and engagement program we have, and it's all voluntary. It's when we have more than 23,000 employees in more than 30 countries who are involved, and it's everything from how to be a better environmental steward at work, so how to recycle, where to recycle, what do I do with the toner when it's done, to stream cleanups and working in the community. And we've had, at this point, I think more than 400,000 employee hours dedicated to volunteering. And I think the reason why I bring this up is because this is we do a lot with storytelling. We do a lot with change management and education that is equally important as the changing of the light bulbs, which of course is a block and tackle important part. But when you have that good communication plan and approach, it makes it even that much more effective.
So I just want to point out, Lisa herself was a math major years ago and a colleague at Pew, and now, of course, does sustainability for the city of Baltimore, but has done leading energy work for universities as well. And I would think that we agree with science backgrounds as well as policy and legal backgrounds in some of our cases. I think it really is helpful to build on that kind of base of scientific engineering, whatever those skills are that you are going to consume. But I will say, I think often women aren't as confident if they're not the expert on everything in a way that men managers often feel quite confident. If you look at the head of our government, for example, who feels quite competent to speak on all kinds of issues without the expertise. So I think it's really, as a manager, not a great example maybe, but I think there's often a confidence gap with women that really isn't substantive. It isn't really necessary if you have the right people around you, if you
Right.
bring the right expertise in, and you bring the skills that you do have to bear.
Totally. I mean, ultimately, we have one of our philanthropic programs is called For Women in Science, where we support women in key, with funding and key sort of parts of their research and career. And so we are, of course, advocates for more women in science, absolutely. But ultimately, I think that if you want to do sustainability, no matter what your background is, you probably have something interesting and new to offer to the conversation. And so we need more people, not less, I would say. But yeah. Anyone else? Any more questions out there? Oh, now we have some questions. Just one more question. Oh, you guys might have to duke it out.
I'm Marc Lacroix with Natural Capital Partners, the father of 4 daughters as well. So women's issues are near and dear to me. Just a question, most of this conversation has been about, what I'd call maybe first world, issues, and just wondering kind of how can we step things up, kind of at the bottom of the pyramid. For example, most people don't realize that 1/3 of the world lights a fire to cook inside. Most of those fires, of course, are lit by women. Most of those women have spent most of their day trying to collect that wood, not doing other things that could further their lives and their families' lives. And of course, the black smoke, the particulate, all the health issues, in addition to the climate issues, seems to be a very, directly related to, women in climate. So, generally speaking, just your opinions. How do we more firmly engage, the bottom of the pyramid and women who are most impacted by the impacts of climate change, and also have the ability to help mitigate, be part of the solution as well?
Yeah, I think, so that BSR report I mentioned in my opening remarks says, I think there's a statistic, and oh gosh, I hope I get this right, is that 80% of women globally are living in poverty. And so I think that's when you really feel that climate, gender and inequality nexus, when you hear statistics like that. And for sure, not having access to funds is limiting when you have to make choices for your family on how to sort of regroup after natural disasters or avoid them in the first place. But I'd love to hear your perspectives on that. Yeah.
Well, you teed it up very nicely for me with access to funds, because that's what I was going to talk about. In 2014, we announced our Catalytic Finance Initiative, where we put up money to help encourage other financial institutions to bring money to the table to address issues just like this one. And so we worked to help finance clean cook stoves, which then can address the particulates, and then, obviously has a lot of benefits for those women and those families. So that's one very real transaction that we did to get more clean cook stoves into homes. And then we also worked with water.org. We talked a little bit about the micro lending, and women entrepreneurs are amazing. Their repayment rates are incredible. Women start more businesses, small businesses. So we're trying to put tools in place so that the funds can get to the people who need them most. And I'll just, not to sound like a commercial, but I should mention that we're working with the Tory Burch Foundation, and we just announced an additional grant to the Tory Burch Foundation. And for those of you who might be women business owners or small business owners, we provide grants and mentoring to women businesses. And so, again, we're just trying to get the capital to the places where they can have the greatest impact.
I think also, one thing that we've done is we've mapped our key raw material ingredients all over the world, and have worked with local nonprofits to develop small farmer cooperatives, most of the time run by women, empowering women in local communities. We have a program in Burkina Faso for our shea butter, I think, that employs over 20,000 women. We have this similar programs for aloe in Mexico, Golonga in Vietnam, and really just sort of all over the world, trying to think about not just our consumer, not just the women in our workforce, but the women upstream in our supply chain, and how do we make better decisions and structure our programs so that they can be brought into this program too. So, yeah, great. Anyone else? No. All right. Thank you guys so much. Oh, do you have no? Okay, great. Thank you so much, everyone.